This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Economics is everywhere. That's the theme of today's show. We're going to start by discussing the economics of terrorism, not just dollars and cents, but how economic incentives shape the supply and demand for terrorists, impact how they organize, and what this implies about public policy. Then, on the second half of the show, we're going to examine how mass incarceration impacts markets for drugs. My first guest is Dr. Ann Bradley. Dr. Bradley is the George and Sally Mayer Fellow for Economic Education and Academic Director at the Fund for American Studies. Previously, she was a terrorism analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. Ann, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So let's apply economics to an area where a lot of people wouldn't think that it would usually apply, is terrorism.
Yes.
So a lot of people will say, these people, particularly with Islamic terrorism from the Middle East post 9/11, they'll say, they're religious zealots, they're just crazy, you can't reason with them. You don't think that's the appropriate way to think about these people?
Correct. I don't think that's the way to generalize how people who are engaging in terrorism, particularly in the Middle East, that may be motivated by religious ideals or have religious goals that they want to implement in society. I don't think we can take all of that and say, carte blanche, they are crazy. Because the problem with crazy is that you can't change crazy. You can lock it up and shoot it, and maybe you have to do that anyway, but it implies that we can't change the behavior if the incentives are changed.
Right. So while there might be some people who fit that kind of crazy definition, terrorism is complex. It involves lots and lots of people. Some of them probably weigh costs and benefits like you or I.
I think that's right. And that really, as I study terrorism, that's the way I start. The research question is, if terrorists are people that have goals that we don't have to agree with, it just because we're applying these principles doesn't mean we agree with them, we like them, or we want them to be successful. But what it does mean is that if we want to stop terrorism, and if we want to have effective policies that actually get us less terrorism, then we need to understand what are the motivations, what are the goals, how are they organizing? And then that allows us to ask the question, well, in what world is terrorism an expensive choice for the marginal person?
Right. I think that's the key, is for the marginal person, because we're trying to decrease the number of recruits or funders. So actually, let's talk about that. So supply and demand, right? Economics.
Right.
Terrorism markets have a supply and demand too. What's the factors that influence the supply or the demand for terrorism?
And my particular research was on Al-Qaeda, or is on Al-Qaeda, so I'll talk a little bit about that. Yeah. And if you look at the origins of Al-Qaeda at a point in time, it's coming from a place that has a lot of political conflict. And this is a group of people, a very small group of people led by bin Laden, and they are coming together through donors, and these donors represent a lot of different people. And so I think that Al-Qaeda organization are the suppliers. There's people on the back end that we don't really see, and that's what intelligence collecting is about, is to try to figure out who's giving them money, who's writing the checks. But from what we know, it's a lot of very different people who are economically wealthy and successful, have jobs, are members of their community. So it's not the story of being just poor and impoverished and illiterate. So there's a supply that's responding to, and then I think the bigger question is, who's demanding it? Who has a willingness to pay? Who says, I really like watching the television when the news reports come on and this attack has been successful?
Right. So a lot of those people, I guess, would be the demanders for terrorism, or kind of the funders, but they don't fit the mold of crazy person who's willing to sacrifice everything.
In fact, when I was at the CIA, that was the thing I was most interested in studying. There's a lot of literature, and there has been previously, on kind of suicide activity, both in the military and in kind of different religious extremist organizations. So we've studied that a little bit. I think what's really interesting is, who is the person who's going to write a $10 million check or a $1 million check or a $10,000 check, but they would never themselves put themselves in an airplane and run it into a building, because the opportunity cost for them of that activity is way too high. So we wanted to really kind of look at what is the motivation around that, and what would it take for them to not fund that, or to get, again, on the margin, the average person to do that less.
Right, the lower funding so that we get less of it. Because Bush was famous for one time saying, I think, we're going to stamp out terrorism everywhere and always type thing. And
yes.
Well, that just strikes me as economically impossible.
Yeah, and it would cost an infinite amount of resources to get terrorism to go to zero. And I think in the policy circles, that's what you hear, because I think voters, want to feel safe. But if we always, talk about this culture of the war on terror, that we're always living in a state of fear, voters are more willing to kind of give a blank check to the state to fight this enemy. So when George Bush is making that statement right after 9/11, people are afraid and voters are demanding this type of language. But I think it's an unwinnable policy proposition.
Right, because there's some positive cost, and as you stamp out more, there's going to be an increasing cost. People think it's weird when economists will say the optimal amount of crime is not zero.
It's not zero,
and
right.
It's because it's costly to get rid of it.
And, we all want to drive cars, and we want to have our laptops, and we want access to the internet, and we want to ride in airplanes. And so if we want these things, there's some risk, of terrorism and other bad things, but we can't make the risk go to zero.
So it's about weighing, of course, it's economics here, weighing costs and benefits from our perspective of how much more resources should we be putting to lower it.
Yes.
But in order to effectively do that, we need to think about how are they weighing costs and benefits. Yes. So what are the things that influence how the terrorists view the benefits? Mm-hmm. And then let's think about their costs too.
So in particular with Al-Qaeda, it's a unique organization because it started with one person's vision, which if you think about successful entrepreneurs that operate in legitimate markets, they also have a vision. So, bin Laden has a vision. He comes out right away and is very clear about his goals. He wants U.S. kind of out of the Middle East in general, alliance with Israel. He wants that to end. And he wants to restore the caliphate. So he has policy goals, he has economic goals, he has political goals that are all wrapped into that. And he organizes this little organization to try to effectively accomplish that. So that's his goal. But you have to think about just the same kind of the distinction between the entrepreneur and the worker in the firm, right? So the person who signs up to be part of Al-Qaeda, their motivations are very different than the top leadership. And what we know from the early days, Al-Qaeda's changed a lot, but from the early days, it was a paramilitary type organization with command and control. Information and orders came from the top. The cells were fairly small and oftentimes didn't really communicate. So they were specialized. This one did recruiting, this one did this type of training, etc. And so that was to keep the organization on mission, because you don't want mission creep. If you get mission creep, if the workers actually realize, wow, maybe, I'm going to die and maybe this isn't a good idea, then they're going to abort the mission. So there's kind of these principal agent problems that we see in firms that play out in terrorist organizations as well.
So while we might not change bin Laden or bin Laden's successors' minds about the benefits of engaging in this activity, what are the things that we could do on the margin that would decrease their workers' view of it being beneficial to be involved in terrorism?
I think there's some things that are, in real terms, pretty easy to do. One thing is just to, change our policy about involvement in the Middle East. I say easy because on paper, that's very easy. You just kind of stop doing some of the things you were doing. I think it's very hard politically to achieve that goal. But terrorists use these type of policies, and they can be very well intentioned. So we're not, kind of judging that right now, the intentions of the American policymakers. But what we're saying is the perceptions of the recruits, the people who are signing up to fight for terrorism, are based on their interpretations of what the U.S. Is trying to do in that area. So I think just even the way we talk about it in the media could be changed. I think we can do things to promote more trade regionally, to promote more international trade. I mean, the long solution is economic freedom. If you look at the places that are most besieged by terrorism, they are either not ranked because we don't have good data for them, or they're in the bottom of the economic freedom of the world index. So all the data that we have suggests that there's certain institutional conditions that make ripe environments for terrorists. And again, what are they doing? They're trying to affect social, economic, religious, political change. And it's often a zero-sum power fight on the ground. So to the extent that U.S. policy can change that, I think we need to be honest and say, we can't make Afghanistan free by writing some nice, policy about it. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, they have to become free. Freedom is an emergent order. right? People have to have, there's an ethos of freedom that's required. So what are the things we can do to get that? Again, I think trade, I think, the war on drugs has really profound implications because of Afghanistan's opium, agricultural crops, things like that.
Meaning that, so in terms of the terrorist ability to attract funding, the war on drugs helps fund it.
I think it helps fund it, and I think it legitimizes cartels. So let's just say we could roll back the global war on drugs. You delegitimize those stakeholders. You delegitimize the cartels. And so now that kind of power fight is over. That platform for power is over. And I think that would do a lot to facilitate trade, entrepreneurship. That's what we need on the ground, because that's what's going to change the opportunity cost for the marginal terrorist.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting perspective, because you're kind of going more to the roots of this and diverting them into other activity versus a lot of policy, it seems to me, God, I hate the TSA, but a lot of policy, it seems, is very reactive in the United States of just trying to raise the cost of a particular activity.
Yes.
What's the consequences of being successful, let's say, raising the cost of attacking airlines?
Yeah, so this is a great question, because there's a lot of literature on this. And in the 70s, airline hijackings were kind of the MO of a lot of terrorists. And so there was a crackdown on kind of airline safety. And what did terrorists do? They just went to kind of assassinations and kidnappings. So if we don't fundamentally alter the demand, we're just going to shift them into other activities. I call it, whack-a-mole, the game you play. It's a frustrating game because the mole comes back. So if you're not dealing with the underlying causes of why people choose this, you're just going to get a different form of it. So Al-Qaeda merges to ISIS. So we can make defeats in ISIS and we can do things to weaken them, but it's not going to fundamentally change what ISIS is after, and the people are going to find different ways to do that.
I think this is really important stuff. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, we're coming closer to home to examine the effects of mass incarceration in Texas. Stick around.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeVitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes. The Helen Jones Foundation.
Founded in 2013, the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University promotes the teaching and study of free market economics. As part of our programming, we sponsor a public lecture series open to students, faculty, staff, and the general public in the Lubbock community. Often, the speakers in that series are the guests that you see right here on Free to Exchange. More information is available at www.fmi.ttu.edu or by email at free.market@ttu.edu. Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Scott Cunningham. Dr. Cunningham is Associate Professor of Economics at Baylor University. He's an expert on the study of crime, risky behavior, prostitution, and drug policy. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben.
So today, let's talk a little bit about incarceration and in Texas in particular. And I know you've studied this topic along with some of the other areas that you work in. Bring us back in history a little bit. What's the situation here in Texas in the early 1980s in terms of our prison situation?
So there was a overcrowding problem in Texas in the late 70s, and there was a class action lawsuit brought against Texas Department of Corrections for inhumane treatment of prisoners.
Inhumane just because it was
overcrowding. They were using prisoners to police one another. They were denying them health care. It sounded like it was a prison camp kind of scenario. And so surprisingly, the TDC, the Texas Department of Corrections, lost, which was a surprise. So what happened was the TDCJ became pretty dysfunctional after that. They had a lot of turnover.
TDCJ is the
Texas Department of Criminal Justice.
Right.
And they had a lot of turnover. They became sort of a politically inept kind of agency, and they stopped building prisons.
So what was the outcome of the lawsuit, though?
The outcome of the lawsuit was that they would go under federal supervision, and they would no longer be able to overcrowd for any period of time. But the problem is, over this period of time, in the United States and in Texas, arrests are just rising, crime's rising.
This is the crack epidemic here.
Epidemic, war on drugs more generally. And but they can't overcrowd, and they're not building any prisons. So as a result of this like swelling of the flow into prisons, they're just paroling like crazy.
So people are getting out earlier because they just have no place for them. So enter our former governor then, comes into office and starts to change things.
Yeah,
right?
so in 1991, Ann Richards becomes governor, and she is interested in rehabilitating prisoners. And specifically, she's worried about substance abuse. But she ends up working with some tough on crime politicians, and they managed to get about $1 billion to build prisons. And so for the first time in Texas history, there's just a massive prison construction campaign. They build about 25 prisons in about 2 years.
Wow.
So go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So the size of the prison capacity doubles in 2 years. It just swells. They're no longer facing constraints. They no longer have to parole anymore.
Right. So actually, this sounds like what happened at my house not long ago. I built a wine cellar, and my wife looked at it and said, wow, that's a lot more space than we have wine. And I said, well, you don't build a wine cellar for the wine you have.
Right.
You build it for the wine you expect you're going to have.
Right.
So here now they've doubled prison capacity, but you don't have an instantaneous doubling of prisoners. But incarceration rates, they must start using the space.
They do. They start using it. It's interesting. You would think, you would think in your example, you build the bigger wine cellar, you would start buying more wine.
Right.
But that's not what really happened. They didn't start arresting more people. The flow into prisons didn't change. What happened was the flow out changed. So, usually you have people coming in, people coming out. People coming in staying the same. But if you stop letting them leave, then it'll swell the prison population. So in a short period of time, because they just quit paroling, not exclusively, but their parole rates plummeted, they ended up just ballooning. The prison population doubled in 2 years. The incarceration rate did.
Yeah, that's definitely not how my wine cellar got bigger, because
Yeah,
I didn't stop consuming
Exactly.
what was in there.
Exactly.
It's the outflow still happens.
Right.
So, I mean, that's encouraging in some ways, right? Because the cops and the judges didn't respond by just arbitrarily arresting more, hitting people with worse fines. But it does change the calculus then. So if we bring economics to bear on this and start thinking classic economics of crime model, right? Of the reward times the probability of punishment times the severity of punishments tells me whether I should commit a crime or not.
Right.
In this case, criminals must observe that paroles are going down, which means your expected sentence is much longer.
Yeah, that's what you would think. I mean, we in this paper, or in this study, in a separate study, we're looking at crime, but in this study, we're looking at drug use, because typically incarceration is really attached to the war on drugs. And so we're wanting to know, is it actually disrupting the drug markets? And so you would think that with these longer sentences and lower parole rates, that drug users would say, I probably need to not use because there's now this higher penalty associated with it.
Were the drug users getting bigger penalties in terms of not getting paroled as much as it was the drug sellers? Because usually I think of it as a supply side drug war for the most part.
Well, unfortunately, the data doesn't allow us to get at exactly who these people are that are being incarcerated. So we just have gross incarceration rates. We don't know what these people are going to prison for. So we don't know.
So what did you find then in terms of, did this increasing the severity of punishment by having effectively having longer sentences, did it disrupt the drug market? Did it decrease drug use?
Well, so we looked at a lot of things. We got data from the DEA on all of their undercover drug purchases. And so we got this large series of cocaine and heroin prices. So our thought was, if it's disrupting the drug markets, maybe it'll shift demand, maybe it'll shift supply, maybe it would show up in drug prices, but we find no change in cocaine or heroin prices, no change in cocaine or heroin purity. So it doesn't appear to be disrupting the actual drug markets, evidenced by the prices. But then what we looked at was, maybe it's maybe it is deterring people. And if it was deterring people, then we would expect to see a decrease in people going into treatment for drugs. So that's our proxy. We didn't really have a survey of drug use for adults.
So the logic there being, right, that because they're anticipating a bigger punishment. Fewer people get addicted in the first place.
Right.
So down the chain here, fewer people look for treatment.
That's the idea. That's the idea. So if people are not using as much, then they're less likely to get addicted. If they're less likely to get addicted, they're less likely to get treatment. So we look at it in two different ways. We look at people that are admitting themselves into drug treatment, and we find no effect. So we don't find, we've gone through this series of do we see any evidence for deterrence of drug use? And we can't find it. We can't find it in the drug prices, can't find it in the self-admissions into treatment. What we do find, though, is a different mechanism. We are finding that the mass incarceration is disrupting drug use in the population, but it's not through deterrence. It's basically because it's just taking people in the population that are drug users and just putting them into prisons. So what we find is there's a separate channel by which you can go into drug treatment. There's two dominant ways. You can either admit yourself or you can have a judge admit you. And there's a large reduction in judges admitting people for cocaine and heroin. A huge decrease in that. So it looks like they're just being incapacitated. They were actually going in and they were receiving treatment for drug use. Incarceration goes up, it just sucks them out of the community.
Right. So the drug use that goes down in the community is just because they're in jail, not because they were deterred.
Not because they were deterred.
So let's generalize from this for just one moment then, because I just heard, in the last year on the news, President Trump saying that he was thinking of the death penalty for drug dealers.
Right.
Generalizing from the type of things that we've been talking about here, what would you expect the result of that to be?
Man, with something that severe, it is hard to believe that drug sellers wouldn't respond. Although I'm not sure. It already can be a risky job in the first place. So I guess if there was going to be the death penalty for drug traffickers, I would expect domestic drug sales to shift. Maybe they would be replaced by international drug sales. So there is a lot of fluidity between the domestic market and the international market, especially for things like heroin. And so, but if they're domestic sellers, it's not clear. I would think that something that severe would disrupt the market.
Yeah, I was thinking just in terms of the displacement effect, like you were finding in the prison. If you're literally killing people, those ones are going to stop dealing, but they might just be replaced by somebody else later.
Right.
Just spitballing on that.
Yeah.
So I know you've studied mass incarceration in lots of other contexts too. What's the general relationship that you see with the war on drugs and mass incarceration, not just in Texas, but other places?
Well, it's interesting that you usually hear about the war on drugs being the driver of mass incarceration, and it's definitely true that we are incarcerating more people for drug offenses than we ever had. But we're actually also incarcerating people for longer periods of time for rape, robbery, larceny, every crime. So I think what I've learned is that the war on drugs is definitely a part of the growth in incarceration, but it seems to be more generally a war on crime. It's just the states have become very strict about crime, and now they punish it very severely. So a lot of the growth in incarceration has actually been selecting on violent offenders. And there has been a tremendous growth in nonviolent offenders too. They're absolutely filling the prisons. But there's actually been a large increase in the number of people in prison for violent offenses, which you don't hear as much about. The thing that I've learned, though, is mass incarceration has had a profound impact on minority communities. So African Americans are only 13% of the population, but they make up about 40% of the prisons. And most of the imprisonment is males. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my earlier research had been how mass incarceration was disrupting the marriage markets for African Americans. So it's creating the shortage of black men. And so as a result of that, the women face a mathematical shortage. There's just not enough men for any kind of monogamous relationship, excluding interracial marriages. So if there's not enough men, and that means women face a shortage, men face a surplus of women, then the bargaining position between the two of them has changed. Women face a much harder marriage market. They may be willing to tolerate a lot of things that they wouldn't otherwise. Men may have fewer incentives to be committed. They may be able to have lots of partners. And so, part of my research in the past has been, well, how has mass incarceration affected the bargaining position of the women?
Wow, this is why economists are wonderful. We start on mass incarceration in Texas, and next thing you know, we're in the marriage market, in particular minority communities.
That's right.
The logic of economics is awesome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks,
I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Well, I told you today's episode was going to be about economics everywhere. The economic way of thinking, of modeling human behavior, is universal. It applies to everybody. It doesn't mean people just are narrowly selfish or care about dollars. What it means is people perceive things as costs and benefits to themselves, and they weigh these accordingly and make trade-offs. This applies to drug users who face harsher penalties of mass incarceration and how that ripples all the way into their marriage markets. And it also applies to terrorists. They're not crazy people who are unable to be reasoned with or thought rationally about. They just have different goals, often that we disagree vehemently with, but we have to understand how they perceive costs and benefits if we're going to optimally address how to decrease terrorism. And that was the point of our first guess of how we need to get to the root causes of it and decrease the reasons that they become terrorists in the first place, and to give them better opportunities through trade and economic freedom. I think that's a lot better way going forward than someone taking away my liquids at the airport. We'll see you next time.